Hello friends! Let's embark on a journey through the world's classic fairy tales together. The first story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is Snow White. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a princess with skin as white as snow and a heart just as pure. Her name was Snow White. Snow White lost her mother at a very young age, filling the kingdom with sorrow. One day the king brought home a beautiful queen from a neighboring country. The new queen was indeed beautiful, but her heart was filled with wickedness. In the queen's room was a very special item, a talking magic mirror. This mirror could reveal who was the fairest of them all. Every morning, the queen would stand before the mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always respond, "My queen, you are the fairest of them all." The queen was very pleased to hear this. Every time she was told she was the fairest, it brought joy to her heart. As days passed, Snow White grew more and more beautiful. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as roses, and her hair as black and shiny as the night sky. "What would you like to do today, Snow White?" the palace maids would always ask her. But Snow White preferred spending her time in the garden, full of blooming flowers, over the splendid palace. One day, while Snow White was singing with the flowers in the garden, small birds gathered around her. "Let's sing together, friends." Snow White enjoyed her time happily with the birds. Snow White's kindness was as beautiful as her appearance. She was kind to everyone, and the palace staff loved her dearly. The queen asked the mirror again, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But today the mirror gave a different answer. "My queen, you are beautiful, but Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen could not believe what she heard and asked again, "What are you saying? Is that true?" "Yes, my queen. It's true. Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen's face turned red with rage. Her heart filled with anger and jealousy. "Snow White is more beautiful than me? That's unacceptable." The queen's heart was filled with rage and jealousy. She decided to get rid of Snow White, who she saw as a threat to her beauty. Thus she summoned the most trusted hunter in the palace. "Hunter, I have a very important task for you," said the queen. "Take Snow White into the forest and get rid of her." The hunter was shocked to hear the queen's command. "But, my queen, Snow White is the treasure of our kingdom. How can I?" "If you do not follow my orders, you too will face death," shouted the queen. The hunter had no choice but to take Snow White into the forest, though his heart was heavy and troubled. He knew well that Snow White was always kind and had a warm heart. On their way to the forest, Snow White shared joyful stories with the hunter. She marveled at the beauty of the forest and asked the hunter various questions. But the hunter's heart was torn between the queen's orders and compassion for Snow White. "How can I harm such a pure and beautiful child?" the hunter whispered to himself. Finally, when they reached deep into the forest, the hunter made his decision. "Snow White, I cannot harm you. The queen has ordered me to kill you, but I cannot do it." The hunter released Snow White and helped her safely escape. He then decided to deceive the queen. To trick the queen, the hunter killed a deer in the forest, took its heart, and presented it to the queen as Snow White's. Snow White ran into the forest. Her heart was filled with fear, but her steps did not falter. "Where should I go?" Snow White murmured to herself. The surroundings grew darker and the forest seemed strange and frightening to her. But Snow White gathered her courage and continued to walk. "Don't be afraid, Snow White. You can do this," she encouraged herself. As she walked, Snow White encountered various animals, small rabbits, fluttering butterflies, and singing birds. They did not shy away from her but instead followed her. "Are you lost like me?" Snow White asked her animal friends. Though they could not respond, their eyes offered Snow White comfort. The forest was vast and complicated. Snow White had to avoid thorn bushes and climb over large rocks. She was tired and hungry, but she did not give up and kept walking. As night fell, the forest became an even scarier place. Strange noises filled the darkness, and Snow White did not know what awaited her. But she rested for a moment under a large tree and gazed at the stars. "This will all end. I will find my way," Snow White resolved under the starlight. As Snow White wandered through the forest, suddenly a small house appeared before her eyes. "Oh wow, who lives here?" Snow White curiously approached the house. The house looked very neat and tidy from the outside. Snow White gently knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Is anyone there?" Snow White asked again, but it remained quiet. Full of curiosity, Snow White slowly opened the door and entered. What she found inside was surprisingly adorable. There were 7 small plates, cups, and spoons on a tiny table. "Who lives here?" Snow White murmured to herself. She looked around the house in awe. Everything was so orderly and clean. There were even 7 small chairs and beds. Snow White was exhausted from her long journey. She carefully sat on one of the beds and felt so comfortable that she lay down. "I'll just close my eyes for a moment," Snow White thought. Shortly after, Snow White fell into a deep sleep. She felt a sense of relief, having found a safe place away from the dangers of the forest. The 7 dwarfs were returning home from mining gold in the mountains that day. After a long day's work, they were heading back to their little house. "We did a lot of work today," the dwarfs encouraged each other as they entered their home. But as soon as they stepped inside, they felt something unusual. "Someone has been here. Look, there are traces of used plates on the table," said the first dwarf. "And here, someone has used my bed," exclaimed the second dwarf in surprise. All 7 dwarfs began to check their beds and belongings. Then they discovered Snow White sleeping in the bed at the very back. "Oh wow, who is this?" The dwarfs were astonished and looked at each other. Snow White was sleeping beautifully, and looking at her peaceful face, all the dwarfs felt their hearts melt. "She's a really beautiful lady," whispered the third dwarf. "But how did she get here?" wondered the fourth dwarf. The dwarfs decided not to wake Snow White. "Let's wait until the lady wakes up. When she does, we can hear the whole story," suggested the fifth dwarf. So the dwarfs quietly gathered around Snow White, waiting for her to wake up. They gazed at Snow White, who was sleeping adorably. When Snow White gently opened her eyes, she discovered 7 pairs of curious eyes surrounding her. "Where am I?" Snow White asked cautiously. "We are 7 dwarfs who mine gold in the mountains," answered the first dwarf. "But how did you get here?" Snow White shared her story with the dwarfs, one by one. After she finished, the dwarfs all felt sympathy for Snow White. "It might be dangerous for you to stay here," said the second dwarf worriedly. "But don't worry. "We'll help you." Snow White and the 7 dwarfs decided to live together. The dwarfs taught Snow White how to help with the housework, and every day when the dwarfs returned from work, Snow White prepared a delicious dinner for them. "Snow White, with you here, our home has become much brighter," said the 3rd dwarf. The dwarfs loved listening to Snow White's songs and stories. Snow White gradually became accustomed to life with the dwarfs. She deeply appreciated how the dwarfs treated her like family. "Thank you all for becoming my new family," said Snow White. Thus Snow White and the 7 dwarfs helped each other and spent their days filled with laughter and joy. Their home was always full of happiness and laughter. The queen stood in front of the mirror once again and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But the mirror's answer was not what the queen expected. "My queen, you are indeed beautiful, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs in the forest, is the fairest of them all." The queen trembled with rage. "Snow White is still alive? I must eliminate her myself." She began to devise a new plan for revenge. The queen decided to disguise herself so no one could recognize her. She rummaged through an old wardrobe to find clothes and accessories that would make her look like a witch. "With these clothes and this mask, no one will recognize me," the queen whispered as she began to change her appearance. She also wore an old scarf to cover her hair and a large hat to conceal her face. The queen stood in front of the mirror to check her disguise. "And now, I look like a perfect old woman. Snow White will never recognize me." With that, the queen set out to find Snow White in the forest. Disguised, the queen entered the forest, holding a beautiful comb poisoned with her hands. "I'll deceive Snow White with this comb. She won't be able to resist its beauty." Knowing that Snow White would be alone while the dwarfs were at work, the queen approached the dwarf's house and knocked on the door. When Snow White opened the door, she was surprised to see a kind-looking old woman standing before her. "Hello, grandmother. Can I help you with anything?" "Oh, my pretty girl. I'm a merchant who sells this beautiful comb. It will suit you perfectly," the queen said in a disguised voice, showing the comb to Snow White. Snow White was enchanted by the beauty of the comb. "It's really beautiful, grandmother. But my dear, this is a gift for you. Try it," the queen insisted kindly, handing the comb to Snow White. Snow White found it hard to refuse and accepted the comb, beginning to brush her long hair with it. The moment the poisoned comb touched Snow White's hair, she collapsed. The queen internally celebrated as she escaped the forest. "And now Snow White will no longer threaten my beauty." When the 7 dwarfs returned home from mining gold and found Snow White collapsed on the floor, they were shocked and rushed to her side. "Snow White, are you okay?" the first dwarf asked worriedly. But Snow White did not respond. Then the second dwarf noticed the strange comb stuck in Snow White's hair. Look what's here. This comb. Check it out," he shouted to the others. The dwarfs carefully removed the comb, and at that moment Snow White slowly began to regain consciousness. Everyone, how did I get here?" The dwarfs helped Snow White up and explained what had happened to her. "Snow White, you were in danger. This comb was poisoned." Snow White was shocked and thanked the dwarfs for saving her. "If it weren't for you, I would have been in real trouble." Afterward, the dwarfs warned Snow White, "Snow White, don't let anyone into the house from now on. Especially when we're not here, okay?" Snow White took the dwarfs' words to heart and promised to be more careful in the future. "I understand, dwarf friends. I'll listen to you and make sure no more dangerous things happen." The queen learned that her first attempt had failed. But she did not give up and devised a more cunning plan. "This time I will not fail. I must get rid of Snow White." She decided to use a poisoned apple this time. The queen went to her alchemy lab and injected the most potent poison into the apple. One side of the apple was made to look poison-free to deceive Snow White. After poisoning the apple, the queen disguised herself once more, this time more carefully to ensure no one could recognize her. "With this appearance, even Snow White will not recognize me." The queen put the poisoned apple in a basket and, pretending to be an old woman selling apples, headed to the dwarf's house. She waited for a moment when the dwarfs were away from the house to encounter Snow White. Upon reaching the dwarf's house, the queen called out in a friendly voice, "Would you like to see some apples? These apples are delicious." Snow White was initially cautious, but the apple the queen offered looked so tempting. "That apple looks really delicious." "Yes, my dear. This apple is special. Just one bite and you'll feel the happiest in the whole world," the queen lied, enticing Snow White. Snow White hesitated for a moment but eventually fell for the queen's deceit and accepted the apple. As soon as she bit into the apple, the poison spread through her body. The queen smiled with satisfaction as Snow White collapsed. "And now Snow White will no longer threaten my beauty." The moment Snow White bit into the poisoned apple, her eyes began to close and she fell into a deep sleep. It was such a profound sleep that Snow White could not wake up from it, as if she had fallen into an eternal slumber. When the dwarfs returned home in the evening, they found Snow White collapsed on the floor. "Snow White!" They rushed to her side, alarmed. The dwarfs tried their best to wake Snow White, but no matter how hard they tried, she would not awaken. Their home was filled with sorrow and worry. What happened here? Why is Snow White like this?" They noticed the half-eaten apple and said, "This apple must have been poisoned." Snow White ate it and ended up like this. The dwarfs did everything they could for Snow White. They made her comfortable and continued to pray for her to wake up. But Snow White remained in her deep sleep. As days passed, the dwarfs' hearts grew heavier and heavier. They feared losing Snow White. "We hope our beloved Snow White can return to us." In the middle of the forest, in a place where time seemed to stand still, Snow White lay peacefully inside a glass coffin made with love by the 7 dwarfs. Her face was peaceful, and even in the sleep of death, she remained breathtakingly beautiful, with breath still seemingly present. One day a prince traveling through the forest stumbled upon this place and was captivated by Snow White's beauty, her pure white skin, ruby red lips, and coal-black hair. Drawn to her beauty, the prince approached the glass coffin and, captivated by Snow White, kissed her pale forehead with love and reverence. At that moment something magical happened. The prince's pure love-filled kiss broke the curse of the poisoned apple. Suddenly Snow White's heart began to beat gently, her cheeks regained color, and she slowly woke from her deep sleep. Taking a deep breath and opening her eyes, Snow White locked eyes with the prince, and at that moment, they both fell in love at first sight. Tears of joy streaming down his face, the prince confessed his love to Snow White. "Snow White, I love you. Will you marry me?" Moved by the prince's warm words, Snow White's heart was touched, and they promised to marry each other. Meanwhile, the queen heard that Snow White was still alive and went to find the princess. She sneaked into Snow White and the prince's wedding but was caught by the soldiers. The soldiers rushed to the queen and put on her red-hot iron shoes. The queen began to jump around as if she were dancing with joy. And so the queen kept dancing. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after for many years to come. The second story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is The Little Mermaid. In the vast, blue depths of the ocean, a mysterious kingdom inhabited by mermaids existed. This realm boasted beautiful coral and palaces adorned with glittering pearls. "What adventure shall we embark on today, my lovely princesses?" the king asked his 6 daughters. His voice echoed majestically throughout the kingdom. Among them, the youngest princess was particularly striking. Her voice was the most beautiful in the entire ocean, clear and melodious like a jade marble. She was always brimming with curiosity about the world above the sea, eager to uncover its hidden stories. "Father, what lies above the sea? Is the sand on the beaches truly soft? What does a sunset look like?" the youngest princess inquired, her eyes sparkling with wonder. The king, taken aback, replied, "My dear, you are still too young. You cannot go above the sea until you turn 15. The princess nodded, promising to keep her word, yet she continued to dream about the world above, feeling an intense longing in her heart. The awaited day finally arrived. The youngest mermaid princess turned 15. "Oh wow, I can finally go above the sea." Overwhelmed with excitement, her heart thumped wildly. "You must be thrilled today, little sister. Tell us all about the outside world," her sisters said, surrounding her with envy. The princess smiled and began her adventure, her tail cutting through the water powerfully. Soon, she left the deep sea behind, reaching the gently dancing waves above. Cautiously, she raised her head above the water, looking at the outside world for the first time. "Oh wow, it's so beautiful," she exclaimed as she saw the sun setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and the sea in hues of purple. Mesmerized by the sight, she whispered to herself, "I've waited so long to see this." The sound of the waves seemed like music, and the wind gently caressed her hair. During her first adventure above the sea, the youngest mermaid princess spotted a large ship where bright lights flickered, and the sounds of merry music and laughter reached her ears on the breeze. "Oh, what's happening over there?" she wondered, approaching carefully. She swam closer to the ship, and upon arriving, she was astounded by the lavish scene before her. People were dancing in splendid attire, and beautiful music filled the air. "This must be a birthday party for a prince," she whispered excitedly to herself. At that moment, she saw a young prince shining brightly. So he is the prince," she murmured to herself. His appearance was as radiant as a star, and his smile as warm as the sun. The princess felt her heart begin to race at the sight of him, captivated by his charm. "I've never seen anything so magnificent in the sea," she whispered, her heart filled with a love at first sight. Suddenly thunder roared, and a storm broke out, darkening the sky with black clouds and flashing lightning. The sea became violently turbulent. Huge waves rose like mountains before crashing down onto the ship, which began to break apart under the assault. The youngest mermaid princess witnessed it all from beneath the water. "Oh no, the prince!" Her heart pounded with worry. Without hesitation, she swam through the churning waters toward the sinking ship. The sea was a whirlpool of chaos, but she bravely searched for the prince without fear. Then, she found the prince struggling in the water, losing consciousness and sinking. "My prince!" She quickly reached him, wrapping her arms around his body. With powerful strokes of her tail, she swam upwards, fighting the storm to bring him to safety. Her only thought was to save the prince, her love and courage proving stronger than the storm. She never gave up until she had brought him to safety. The mermaid princess carrying the prince struggled towards the beach. The waves gently guided her and the moonlight showed her the way. When she reached the shore, she laid the prince gently on the soft sand. His face was pale yet still shone like a star, and his smile was as radiant as the sun. Sitting beside him, she held his hand tightly and prayed fervently, "Please wake up, my prince. Please come back to life." Her voice was trembling and desperate. Then, as the first light of dawn softly illuminated the beach, a miraculous thing happened. The prince slowly opened his eyes and saw the beautiful mermaid princess vaguely. "Where am I?" he asked weakly. His voice was soft and shaky, but to the princess it was the most beautiful music. Tears of joy streamed down her face as she looked at the prince. But before he could get a clear look at her, she quietly left and returned to the sea, her heart filled with gratitude and relief that the prince was alive. As dawn broke, the beach became a quiet, peaceful place. After saving the prince, the youngest mermaid princess hid and watched from a distance. Soon, bells rang out and beautiful ladies rushed to the seaside where the prince lay. The princess, shocked, hid silently behind a rock. Her heart raced, but she decided to stay and watch over the prince. One of the ladies approached the prince gently and helped him up. The prince looked at her bewilderedly, and the lady took him to the church. Watching from afar, the princess felt her heart ache. Even though she was the true savior, she couldn't reveal this fact. With a heavy heart, she returned to the sea. From that day on, her thoughts were filled with the prince. What kind of person is he? Could I meet him if I became human? She constantly pondered and imagined, but kept these thoughts as her secret. Although she had saved the prince, she couldn't tell anyone. Her love remained hidden deep within her. The youngest mermaid princess visited her grandmother, a wise mermaid with vast knowledge about the sea, land, and human world. Upon her arrival, her grandmother greeted her with a warm smile. "What's on your mind, my precious granddaughter?" she asked softly. Without hesitation, the princess shared her curiosity. "Grandmother, do humans truly become stars when they die? What are their lives like? Why can't we be like them?" The grandmother smiled and explained, "Humans live intense but short lives. They love, dream, and sometimes suffer. And when they die, their souls ascend to the sky and become stars." The princess's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "I wish to become human, to feel and experience their world." The grandmother gently held her hand and said, "But we mermaids belong to the sea. It's also beautiful to dream between the sea and land." Despite the joyous ball happening in the mermaid kingdom, the youngest mermaid princess felt heavy-hearted, filled with longing for the human world and the prince. Unable to bear it, she made a decision. Quietly leaving the ball, she swam through the dark waters to seek the sea. The witch's home was near a dark whirlpool in the deepest part of the sea. "Please help me. I want to become human and meet the prince," the princess pleaded with the witch. The witch laughed wickedly and said, "Love a human? How foolish. But if that's truly what you wish, I can help. But remember, it comes at a great cost." The princess replied without hesitation, "I'll do anything. Please turn me into a human." The witch smirked, outlining the conditions. You'll lose your tail and gain legs, but you'll lose your beautiful voice and feel immense pain as if walking on knives. And if you fail to win the prince's true love, you'll turn into sea foam at the first dawn after his wedding to another. Terrified yet determined by her love and longing, the princess agreed. I'm ready. Please do it. The witch, with a malicious grin, said, "Give me your voice, and I'll grant your wish." She then prepared a magical potion, shimmering and emitting strange fumes. The princess, taking a deep breath, handed over a small pearl containing her voice, losing it forever. "And now drink this potion. But remember, there's no turning back. Once you become human, you can never return to being a mermaid. And if you don't earn true love, you'll turn into foam," the witch warned sternly. Despite her fears, the princess's love for the prince was overwhelming. "I'll take the risk," she resolved, and drank the potion in one gulp. The moment she did, she felt excruciating pain as her tail transformed into legs, and she passed out from the agony. Awakening from a deep sleep, the youngest mermaid princess found herself in a whole new world. As a human, she could walk on two legs but had lost her voice. When the prince found her, he asked, "Who are you, and where are you from?" Unable to speak, she responded with only a beautiful gaze. The prince felt she held a special something and took her to his palace, caring for her with great kindness. She was dressed in fine clothes and fed delicious meals. Together, they strolled through the palace gardens and attended splendid balls. The prince adored her like a sister, always wanting her by his side. Despite the pain with every step, the princess endured it for the joy of being with the prince, dancing and exploring with him, each moment a new and mystical experience. The time spent with the prince was precious to the youngest mermaid princess. She longed to express her love but couldn't speak. One day she overheard that the prince wished to marry the lady who saved him at church, believing she was his savior. "She saved me. I want to spend my life with her," he said. The princess plunged into deep sadness, realizing the prince mistook another for his rescuer. She tried to approach the prince, hoping to convey her feelings through her eyes and gestures, but she couldn't reveal the truth. The prince, seeing her sadness, remarked, "Do you know her? You resemble her." His words only deepened her pain. The princess wanted to confess her love, but it remained a silent shadow circling the prince, who had already given his heart to another. In the palace garden, the youngest mermaid princess walked alone with a heavy heart amidst the buzz of the prince's upcoming marriage to a neighboring princess. Remembering the prince's declaration to marry his savior, her heart shattered. The prince's parents had arranged for him to meet the princess from the neighboring kingdom, who was mistakenly believed to be his lifesaver. Upon meeting her, the prince immediately proposed. The news broke the mermaid princess's heart into 1,000 pieces. She wept quietly, feeling an immense pain, as she couldn't reveal that she was the true savior. The bells of a grand church rang throughout the kingdom, announcing the marriage of the prince to the neighboring princess. The day was serene, and everything seemed to celebrate their union. A lavish and spectacular wedding took place on a ship, adorned with sparkling decorations and fragrant flowers, resembling a fairy tale. Jesters danced and musicians played sweet melodies. Amidst the festivities, the youngest mermaid princess cried silently in hiding, knowing her love was sacrificed for another's happiness. "Am I truly destined to become foam?" she pondered sorrowfully, grieving her fate while cherishing the memories of her time with the prince. On the wedding night, as she gazed at the tranquil sea, tears streamed down the mermaid princess's face, her heart filled with sadness. Then her sisters appeared, braving the rough waves. "Take this," they said, offering her a shining knife. "This can turn you back into a mermaid. You must kill the prince." Holding the knife, she approached the prince's room, tormented by her love and suffering. Inside, the prince slept peacefully, a happy smile on his face. Standing beside him, knife in hand, she battled her emotions. "No, I can't harm my beloved prince," she whispered, throwing the knife into the sea. With a heart heavy with love and sorrow, she threw the knife into the sea and then herself, surrendering to the waves. Upon touching the cold water, she began to magically transform into foam, finally ascending to the sky with the wind. The bittersweet tale of the mermaid princess and the prince's love has been passed down through the ages. The third story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is Rapunzel. Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a happy couple. The wife was soon to have a baby, and one day, she suddenly had an intense craving for lettuce. "Oh, look at that fresh lettuce," she exclaimed, standing by the window and looking at the garden of the house next door. The neighbor's garden was filled with beautiful flowers and edible vegetables, among which the lettuce was particularly enticing. However, there was one problem. The owner of the next house was a very scary witch that no one dared to approach. "I really want to eat it. But it would be terrible if the witch caught me." Every day the wife stood by the window, just looking at the lettuce. The husband, worried, said to her, "Don't worry, I'll find a way." But the desire for lettuce grew stronger. "Oh, I really want it. Please get me some lettuce." The wife felt hungry and her body seemed to be getting weaker. The husband, seeing his wife's desperate state, decided, "This won't do, I must get some lettuce somehow." One dusky evening, the husband mustered his courage and sneaked into the witch's garden. Moving stealthily, he looked around and finally got his hands on the most tempting head of lettuce. "I hope this makes my wife happy." Clutching the lettuce, he ran home. When the husband brought the lettuce, a bright smile spread across the wife's face. "I've never tasted such delicious lettuce," she exclaimed, taking a bite of the lettuce. However, the happiness was short-lived, as her craving for lettuce grew even stronger the next day. "Can you get me a little more?" The wife's eyes were filled with a desperate longing for the lettuce. The wife's craving only grew. The husband, seeing his wife's face getting paler day by day, felt heartbroken. "This is bad. If it goes on like this, both the wife and the baby will be in danger. I have no choice, just one more time." He made up his mind. That night, the husband sneaked into the witch's garden again. This time he decided to take more lettuce. Climbing over the fence and into the garden, the husband carefully plucked several heads of lettuce. "Now my wife will be happy." Holding the lettuce to his chest, he quietly headed home. But at that moment, a terrifying voice suddenly came from behind. "How dare you steal from my garden? Let's see." The husband froze in place. Turning around, there stood the witch, eyes flashing, her face red with anger. The husband knelt down, trembling with fear. "Please forgive me. My wife is pregnant, and she really wanted to eat lettuce, so I had no choice." His voice was shaking, and his hands were trembling, humbly clasped in front of the witch. The witch stared at the husband for a moment, then suddenly lifted one corner of her mouth and said, "I'll forgive you, but you have to make me a promise." Kneeling before the terrifying witch, the husband listened to her words. "Please forgive me for the sake of our baby," the husband pleaded desperately. Then the witch set her condition. "All right, but when your wife gives birth to the baby, you must give the baby to me. If you do that, I'll give you this lettuce." The husband's eyes widened. "The baby? But..." The husband hesitated for a long time. But thinking of his wife's health and the well-being of the baby, he eventually had no choice but to accept the witch's demand. I promise. I will give the baby to you, witch." At that moment, a smile spread across the witch's lips. Months passed and the wife gave birth to a healthy baby. The baby was the most adorable being in the world. The wife and husband were happy looking at the baby. However, their happiness was short-lived as the time for the promise had arrived. "Now you haven't forgotten the promise, have you?" One day the witch suddenly appeared and demanded the baby. The husband and wife's hearts were torn, but they could not break the promise with the witch. Thus the baby was handed over to the witch, who named her Rapunzel. Rapunzel grew up to be beautiful and smart. However, when Rapunzel turned 12, the witch decided to hide her from the world. The witch locked Rapunzel in a high tower. The tower was so high that no one could enter, and Rapunzel had to stay there alone. The tower had neither stairs nor a door, only Rapunzel's long hair hanging down from the tower's window. Her hair was long enough to wrap around the tower several times. The witch visited the tower every day and shouted, "Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel would then approach the window, untie her hair, and let it down for the witch to climb up. When the witch climbed up, Rapunzel always greeted her. "Mother, what good stories have you brought today?" Although Rapunzel was lonely, she always remained positive and cheerful. The witch, instead of answering Rapunzel's questions, always maintained a strict demeanor. "Stories? I don't have time to tell stories. You must stay here safely. The outside world is dangerous for you." However, Rapunzel could not hide her curiosity about the outside world. After the witch left, she murmured to herself, "What is beyond there? Someday I want to escape this tower and see everything for myself." A deep desire to experience freedom and see the world outside lived in her heart. Rapunzel expressed her dreams and hopes through her songs. Her singing filled the forest and her voice echoed far and wide. Although Rapunzel was trapped in the tower, her heart and dreams always flew freely. She knew that someday her dreams would come true. A prince wandering through the forest heard a beautiful song that captivated his ears. The sound silenced all other noises in the forest and made the prince stop in his tracks. Following the sound, he was led to a high and old tower. There, the song became clearer, and the prince saw a blonde girl singing from the top window of the tower. The prince returned to the tower every day to listen to her song. His heart gradually fell for her, and eventually he could not resist the desire to meet Rapunzel. He looked around the tower but saw no way to enter. Then one day he heard the witch shouting, "Rapunzel, let down your hair." The prince realized how he could climb up to the tower. The next day the prince gathered his courage and shouted, "Rapunzel, let down your hair." Although Rapunzel was startled by the voice of someone she had never heard before, her pure heart and curiosity led her. She let down her hair, and the prince climbed it to reach the tower. The meeting between the two was like magic. For the first time, Rapunzel saw someone else's face, and the prince was completely captivated by her beauty and purity. The prince confessed his love to her, and Rapunzel accepted his heart. However, they disliked the reality that Rapunzel was trapped in the tower. The prince devised a plan to rescue Rapunzel from the tower. He promised to visit her secretly every night, and they planned their escape together. "I will surely free you from this tower. We can live freely together," the prince told her. Rapunzel gained strength from his words, and they began to dream of a happy future together. Thus, the prince and Rapunzel grew their love for each other, not losing hope even in the face of an impossible situation. Their love became a power that could overcome all obstacles. The love between the prince and Rapunzel deepened. They secretly met every night, making plans for their escape and sharing dreams of the future. However, not everything could go smoothly. The witch was clever and cunning, and she eventually discovered the secret of the two. One day, as usual, the witch climbed Rapunzel's hair to the tower. But her eyes were dark and cold. "Rapunzel, you have deceived me. How could you betray me by bringing a man from the outside world into the tower?" Trembling with fear, Rapunzel answered, "Please forgive me, mother. I just wanted to be with the person I love." However, the witch's heart was already hardened. She decided to punish Rapunzel coldly. The witch cut Rapunzel's golden hair and banished her to a deserted land where no one would find her. Rapunzel was left alone to fight for survival. She remembered the promise with the prince and vowed to survive somehow. Meanwhile, the witch planned to trap the prince. When the prince came to the tower again, the witch imitated Rapunzel's voice to lure him. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Overjoyed, the prince climbed up, but what awaited him was not his beloved Rapunzel, but the furious witch. The witch cursed the prince, saying mockingly, "I'll let you meet Rapunzel again," and pushed him from the tower. Unfortunately, the prince's eyes were pierced by thorns, and he became blind. He was left alone in despair, having lost Rapunzel and his sight. But the power of love was strong. The blind prince wandered endlessly in search of Rapunzel. Rapunzel, too, kept her love for the prince deep in her heart, hoping to meet him again someday. After a long time, the blind prince wandered endlessly. The only consolation in his heart was the memory of his beloved Rapunzel. Hoping to hear her voice, he searched for her every day. Then one day he heard a beautiful song in the forest. It was Rapunzel's singing. The prince struggled towards the sound. Finally, he found Rapunzel in an abandoned garden. Recognizing the prince, Rapunzel ran to him and embraced him tightly. "My prince, you don't know how much I've missed you," Rapunzel said, crying. Her tears wet the prince's face, and miraculously his sight was restored. The prince could see again and, looking at Rapunzel's beautiful face, said, "Rapunzel, my love, you have opened my eyes again. We can now be happy together." They hugged each other tightly, making up for the lost time as much as they could. The prince and Rapunzel returned to the prince's kingdom to start a new life together. The people of the kingdom welcomed them joyously, and the love story of the prince and Rapunzel spread throughout the land. They were moved by Rapunzel's adventures and the prince's devoted love. The prince and Rapunzel became the most beloved couple in the kingdom, and their love deepened over time. Despite facing many difficulties, they overcame all trials together, understanding the true meaning of love. Their love story became a legend that would not be forgotten over time, delivering a message of love and hope to all. The prince and Rapunzel lived happily ever after. The fourth story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is Cinderella. In a quiet village lived a kind-hearted girl named Cinderella. Cinderella had lost her biological parents early and came to live with her stepmother and two stepsisters, who were cruel to her. "Cinderella, bring this." "Cinderella, clean that." From dawn till late at night, Cinderella had to take care of all the household chores. However, Cinderella never complained once. "I understood, sister." "Don't worry, stepmother. Leave it to me." She always managed everything with a bright smile. Despite the hardships she faced, Cinderella's heart remained warm and pure. One day, as the stepmother gave Cinderella more tasks, she said, "Cinderella, you need to be busy again today. You have to prepare dinner and clean every corner of the house." Cinderella, as always, responded with a smile, "Yes, stepmother. I'll take care of everything." It was a bright and sunny morning. As Cinderella and her family were finishing their breakfast, suddenly the sound of a ding-dong came from the front door. Who could it be? Cinderella opened the door. There stood a royal messenger in splendid clothes. "Everyone here is invited to the royal ball. The prince is holding a grand ball to find a bride," said the messenger in a formal tone. Cinderella's stepsisters screamed with joy. "Oh wow, really? A ball at the palace, how splendid! We'll have a chance to meet the prince." They were already excited, imagining what to wear and how to dress up. The stepmother smiled contentedly. "This is a wonderful opportunity. Our daughters will have the chance to catch the prince's eye. We must prepare thoroughly." Cinderella was also very happy inside. "A ball at the palace, I really want to go." But she wasn't sure if she could attend. Her days were filled with chores. "Cinderella, you might want to go to the ball, but you won't have time. There's a mountain of housework," said the stepmother. Cinderella was sad but didn't say anything. On the evening of receiving the ball invitation, Cinderella quietly sat in a corner of her room, lost in thought. How wonderful it would be to attend the ball, to see the splendor of the palace. But she was well aware of her situation. Her clothes were old and dirty, and she couldn't even dream of a splendid dress suitable for the ball. As if sensing her troubles, her stepsisters entered Cinderella's room. "What deep thoughts are you in, Cinderella?" one sister asked. Cinderella replied cautiously, I also want to go to the ball." Upon hearing this, the stepsisters burst into laughter. "You at the ball? How can you go to the palace in those dirty clothes?" the other sister mocked. "Just stay home and clean. That's your job." Cinderella was heartbroken. Yet she still did not give up hope. "Someday I will be able to do what I truly want." Until then, Cinderella continued with her duties patiently. The day of the ball arrived. Cinderella's stepmother and stepsisters, dressed in their most splendid clothes, excitedly headed to the palace. Cinderella bid them farewell from the window, her heart filled with deep sadness. Once the door closed, the house became silent. Unable to hold back any longer, Cinderella began to cry in a corner of the living room. "I wanted to go to the ball too." Her sobs filled the quiet house. Suddenly, a mysterious light filled the living room. Cinderella, startled, looked up to see a beautiful fairy in a splendid dress standing before her. "Don't cry, Cinderella," the fairy said in a warm voice. "I've come to help you." Cinderella looked at the fairy with eyes full of surprise and hope. Really? You will help me?" The fairy nodded with a smile. "Of course, but we must hurry. We need to prepare to take you to the ball." The fairy approached Cinderella and whispered, "Cinderella, we need a few things to go to the ball. First, could you bring me a big pumpkin from the garden and a few mice?" Cinderella, upon hearing the fairy's request, ran to the garden immediately. She returned with the biggest and most beautiful pumpkin and a few mice. "Here you are, fairy godmother. Is this enough?" The fairy smiled and nodded. "Very good, Cinderella. Now let's start the magic." The fairy took out her magic wand and lightly tapped the pumpkin. "Transform into a carriage." In an instant, the pumpkin turned into a splendid carriage. Cinderella's eyes widened in amazement. Next, the fairy approached the mice and tapped them with her wand. "Transform into horses." At that moment, the mice turned into magnificent horses. Cinderella was speechless at the sight. "Oh wow, that's amazing." The fairy smiled at Cinderella and said, "Now we have a carriage and horses for the ball. But this magic won't last forever. You must return before midnight." After preparing the carriage and horses, the fairy turned towards Cinderella. "Now it's your turn, Cinderella." As Cinderella watched with wide eyes, the fairy lifted her magic wand and lightly tapped Cinderella's old dress. Instantly, a radiant light enveloped Cinderella, and her dress transformed into a dazzling gown. The dress sparkled like stars in the night sky, highlighting Cinderella's beauty. "It's so beautiful. It's like a dream," exclaimed Cinderella. But the fairy wasn't done yet. "I have something else for you." The fairy showed Cinderella a pair of sparkling glass slippers. They were as clear and shining as cut crystal. Cinderella tried on the glass slippers, and they fit perfectly. "These slippers will make you the brightest at the ball. But remember, all this magic will disappear at midnight," the fairy cautioned Cinderella. Cinderella, transformed beautifully, stood in front of the magical carriage. "Cinderella, I hope you have a wonderful time at the ball. But never forget, all this magic will vanish at midnight," the fairy reminded Cinderella again. Cinderella looked at the fairy with a puzzled expression. The fairy continued seriously, "At midnight all the magic will be undone. The dress you're wearing, this carriage, even these magnificent horses will all return to their original forms. So you must keep track of the time." Cinderella listened carefully to the fairy and nodded. "Don't worry, fairy godmother. I will return on time, before midnight." Her voice was firm, and she was ready to keep her promise. The fairy smiled upon hearing Cinderella's response. "Good, I believe you will keep your promise. Have a great time and create beautiful memories with the prince." With those final words, the fairy helped Cinderella into the carriage. And she headed to the palace. When the magical carriage arrived at the palace, Cinderella was filled with anticipation. Stepping out of the carriage, she caught everyone's attention. "Who is that beautiful lady?" Whispers spread throughout. Cinderella's dress and glass slippers made her the center of attention. Even her stepmother and stepsisters didn't recognize her. The prince approached Cinderella and asked her to dance. "A dance with me?" She nodded. Cinderella and the prince began to dance to the music. The ballroom was filled with light and music, and the two caught everyone's eye. They looked so good together. Cinderella would never forget that moment. She lost track of time in her happiness, momentarily forgetting her everyday troubles. As the night reached its climax, Cinderella and the prince were still dancing together. The music flowed beautifully and laughter filled the air around them. Cinderella was engrossed in this magical moment. But then from deep within the ballroom, the sound of a ding-ding-ding echoed. Cinderella's heart froze. Oh no, it's already midnight. She hurriedly let go of the prince's hand and started to escape the ballroom. Oh wait! Where are you going? The prince followed her in surprise. Cinderella didn't answer, rushing down the long staircase of the ballroom. Fear filled her heart and all she could think of was getting home before the magic wore off. In her haste, one of her glass slippers came off. Cinderella couldn't stop. She left the glass slipper behind and kept running. The night air was cold and her heart raced. The bell tolled midnight, marking the end of the magical time. Cinderella's heart raced, knowing the magic was fading. As she passed through the great doors of the palace, the magic began to unravel. Her splendid dress instantly turned back into her old, plain clothes. Cinderella felt despair as she felt her appearance changing. However, one of the glass slippers remained on her foot. Though she lost one on the stairs, the remaining slipper remained unchanged by the magic's end. Cinderella ran home, her heart a mix of confusion and fear, yet knowing this single glass slipper was the sole proof of her magical night. Clutching the glass slipper, she dashed through the darkness towards home. The next morning, the entire kingdom was abuzz with big news. The prince is looking for the lady he met at the ball. If she is the owner of the glass slipper, she will marry the prince. The villagers showed great interest in this news. The prince couldn't forget the beautiful lady he met at the ball. The single glass slipper she wore was the only clue. The prince decided, I must find the owner of this glass slipper. She will be my true bride. A massive search operation began at the palace. The prince's servants traveled across the kingdom with the glass slipper, searching for its owner. Is there anyone here who can fit this glass slipper? The prince is looking for you. In every village and city, the servants traveled with the glass slipper. Women lined up to try on the slipper, but it fit no one perfectly. As the prince's servants searched the kingdom for the owner of the glass slipper, they finally arrived at Cinderella's house. All the ladies in this house, please try on this slipper, the servant politely requested. Cinderella's stepsisters were thrilled, arguing over who would try on the slipper first. The first sister tried to fit her foot into the slipper, but it was too big and she couldn't get it to fit despite her efforts. The second sister then attempted, trying to shove her foot into the slipper, but it was too small for her as well. Despite the stepsisters' claims that the slipper fit them, it belonged to no one. Cinderella watched everything from a corner. She recognized the glass slipper from the ball, but she couldn't speak up in front of her stepmother and stepsisters. After the stepsisters tried and failed to wear the glass slipper, the house fell silent for a moment. Then the stepmother, with a suspicious look, turned to Cinderella, who was quietly standing in the corner. "Do you want to try it on?" she asked coldly. Cinderella hesitated but slowly stepped forward. The servant placed the glass slipper before her. As Cinderella gently slipped her foot into the slipper, it fit perfectly as if by magic. The moment Cinderella's foot slid into the slipper, everyone held their breath. "This is truly astonishing," the servant exclaimed. "Miss, you are the lady who danced with the prince that night. The prince has been waiting for you." Will you come to the palace with me? Cinderella's eyes widened in disbelief. This was the moment her dream came true. Yet she remained humble and cautious. Really? The prince is waiting for me? The servant took Cinderella's hand and led her to the carriage. Cinderella boarded the carriage heading to the palace, embarking on a new beginning. When Cinderella returned to the palace, the prince was waiting in the grand hall. Seeing Cinderella descend from the carriage, the prince's eyes sparkled. I've finally found you. I haven't been able to forget you since the night we danced at the ball. Cinderella, a bit nervous in front of the prince, was reassured by his warm smile. The prince carefully took Cinderella's hand, drawing her closer. The short time we spent together was incredibly precious to me. You are my true love. The prince took a deep breath, looked into Cinderella's eyes, and said, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in Cinderella's eyes at the prince's sincere proposal. Cinderella smiled gently and nodded. Yes, Your Highness. I would love that. The two embraced, and at that moment the palace was filled with joy. The couple married and lived happily ever after. The fifth story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, in a small and peaceful village, there lived a lovely girl. She was always bright and cheerful, yet she had one particular favorite thing, a red hood given to her by her grandmother. This red hood suited her so well that whenever she appeared wearing it, the villagers would all say, "Ah, Little Red Riding Hood is here," and welcomed her warmly. My dear granddaughter, wearing this hood will always keep you healthy and happy, her grandmother had said. Little Red Riding Hood was incredibly happy with this gift filled with her grandmother's love. Since that day she never went anywhere without her hood. The villagers always greeted her with warm smiles, and she would greet the villagers back as she wandered through the village, from the small shops to the wide squares and the beautiful riverbanks. Little Red Riding Hood wandered around the village wearing her hood. One morning, while having breakfast with her mother, Little Red Riding Hood, your grandmother is feeling a bit unwell today, her mother said. How about you go and see her? Little Red Riding Hood loved her grandmother very much. Yes, I will visit grandmother's house. Her mother handed her a basket and said, Here are some cake and wine. Grandmother will enjoy them. But be careful, the forest path can be dangerous. Little Red Riding Hood assured her mother not to worry. Mom, don't worry. I'll safely return from grandmother's house, she replied. Holding the basket, she took to the forest path leading to her grandmother's house. Admiring the beautiful flowers along the way, Little Red Riding Hood decided to gather a bouquet for her grandmother. A grandmother will surely be delighted to see these flowers, she murmured to herself. Although the forest was quiet and peaceful, Little Red Riding Hood did not forget her mother's words and remained vigilant. The small forest animals looked at her with curiosity and also greeted her. Hello, I'm on my way to my grandmother's house. Little Red Riding Hood kindly greeted the animals too. While walking through the forest path, Little Red Riding Hood suddenly encountered a large wolf. The wolf showed interest in the basket she was carrying. Hey, Little Red Riding Hood. What's in that basket? The wolf slyly asked. Little Red Riding Hood, thinking the wolf was not scary, naively answered, Hello, Mr. Wolf. This basket contains cake and wine for my grandmother. She's unwell. The wolf became even more interested upon hearing this. Really? Where does your grandmother live? The wolf asked again. Little Red Riding Hood told the wolf about her grandmother's house location. A grandmother's house is deep in the forest. Under a large oak tree, there's a house with a hazelnut fence. The wolf, scheming inside, advised Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Riding Hood, don't hurry and look around. The forest is full of beautiful flowers and wonderful scenery. Grandmother would understand even if you're late. Little Red Riding Hood heeded the wolf's words. Should I? Then I'll pick some more beautiful flowers for grandmother. Naively believing the wolf, she began picking flowers. While Little Red Riding Hood was picking flowers, the wolf sneakily ran off to the grandmother's house. Racing through the forest, the wolf thought about his plan. If I get to the grandmother's house first, he thought, I could deceive both the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf cunningly devised a way to trick the grandmother into letting him inside. Upon arrival, the wolf imitated Little Red Riding Hood's voice and knocked on the door. Grandmother, it's me, Little Red Riding Hood. Please open the door. However, the grandmother recognized the trick. Who is it? That doesn't sound like my granddaughter, the grandmother cautiously inquired. But the wolf did not give up and tricked the grandmother even more cunningly. Eventually he managed to get inside the house. After startling the grandmother, he quickly devoured her. The wolf then dressed in the grandmother's clothes and lay in bed, waiting for Little Red Riding Hood. Meanwhile, Little Red Riding Hood was in the forest's flower garden, gathering a beautiful bouquet of flowers. A grandmother will surely be delighted with these flowers, she thought happily as she picked them. She was so engrossed in picking flowers that she lost track of time. While she was busy, the forest animals gathered around her. A little rabbit sniffed the flowers, sniff, sniff, enjoying their scent, and birds sang beautiful songs from the branches above. Little Red Riding Hood truly enjoyed her time with these forest friends. However, time was quickly passing. Little Red Riding Hood realized she needed to head to her grandmother's house. She hurriedly left the flower garden, thinking, grandmother must be waiting. I must go now. The wolf, dressed in grandmother's clothes, lay in bed, practicing how to imitate the grandmother while waiting for Little Red Riding Hood. If I act just like the grandmother, he thought, Little Red Riding Hood will mistake me for her. The wolf chuckled, pleased with his cunning plan. Then Little Red Riding Hood's voice was heard outside. Grandmother, I'm here, she called out happily. Imitating the grandmother's voice, the wolf replied, pull the latch and come in, my dear. Little Red Riding Hood, without any suspicion, opened the door. At that moment, the wolf was waiting in the grandmother's bed. As Little Red Riding Hood entered, the wolf, pretending to be the grandmother, tried to deceive her. Come in, my dear granddaughter. Grandmother has been waiting just for you. Little Red Riding Hood hurried into her grandmother's house. She found it odd that the door was open but thought her grandmother was expecting her and loudly called out, Grandmother, I'm here. But from that moment there was no answer. Grandmother? Little Red Riding Hood called again, but the house remained silent. Cautiously stepping inside, Little Red Riding Hood looked around. Everything seemed normal, but she felt something was off. Grandmother, where are you? Little Red Riding Hood walked towards the bed with a sense of unease. Standing by the bed, Little Red Riding Hood noticed that her grandmother's appearance seemed different. Her grandmother's face was deeply buried in the blanket and her voice sounded odd. Grandmother, are you all right? Little Red Riding Hood asked cautiously. Grandmother, why are your ears so big? Little Red Riding Hood asked, pointing out her grandmother's unusually large ears. The wolf, still imitating the grandmother's voice, replied, "The better to hear you with, my dear." Suspicion filled Little Red Riding Hood's eyes. "But why are your hands so big?" The wolf, again imitating the grandmother's voice, answered, "The better to hug you with." "But grandmother, why is your mouth so big?" Little Red Riding Hood asked, growing more suspicious. At that moment, the wolf ceased pretending to be the grandmother and revealed his true form. "The better to eat you with," he shouted, leaping out of the bed towards Little Red Riding Hood. After swallowing Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf, satisfied, began to snore loudly. A hunter passing through the forest heard the strange snoring sound and became curious. "I've never heard such a sound in this forest before," the hunter muttered to himself. He cautiously approached the grandmother's house. Peeking through the window, he saw a large wolf sleeping in the bed, not the grandmother. Oh no, did this wolf eat the grandmother? And to be snoring so loudly. The hunter sensed something was amiss. He tiptoed into the house and approached the wolf. Noticing the wolf's unusually swollen belly, he thought, perhaps the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood are still alive inside. He began to carefully cut open the wolf's belly. As the hunter carefully cut open the wolf's belly to rescue Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother safely, the first to emerge was a surprised Little Red Riding Hood, who blinked in the darkness and exclaimed, "Oh, where am I? It's so dark and damp here." Realizing she had been rescued, she gratefully said to the hunter, "Thank you, Mr. Hunter. I'm so grateful." Next, as the hunter continued to cut more cautiously, he managed to rescue the grandmother as well. "Phew, I can finally breathe again," the grandmother sighed with relief. "Thank you for saving me, young man." Together, the hunter, Little Red Riding Hood, and her grandmother filled the wolf's belly with large stones. "And now this wolf will never trouble us again," said the hunter as they carefully stitched up the wolf's belly with thread and needle. After all was done, they sat together in the grandmother's house, drinking warm tea and recounting the day's events. When the wolf finally woke up, he felt unusually heavy. "Why am I so heavy?" he wondered, confused and trying to stand up. Thirsty, he made his way to the well for a drink but found it difficult to walk due to the heaviness. Upon reaching the well, the weight of the stones made it impossible for him to keep his balance, and he fell into the well as he attempted to drink. "Help me," the wolf cried out in his last moments, but it was too late. The wolf disappeared into the depths of the well. Peace was restored to the grandmother's house. Little Red Riding Hood, her grandmother, and the hunter, after witnessing the wolf's end, returned home relieved. "Our forest is safe once again," they said. "Thank you for saving us from the danger of the wolf, Mr. Hunter," Little Red Riding Hood expressed her gratitude. The grandmother, Little Red Riding Hood, and the hunter remained friends for a long time. They often gathered to drink tea and share stories, dreaming of other adventures in the forest. Little Red Riding Hood, from that day forward, walked through the forest more cautiously, always remembering her grandmother's love and the hunter's bravery, and lived happily ever after. The sixth story of the world's classic fairy tales that Mom tells before bedtime is Beauty and the Beast. Long ago, in a distant land, there lived a merchant who made a lot of money. This merchant was so wealthy that many people envied him. The merchant had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. Among them, the daughters were especially beautiful, indescribably so. In particular, the third daughter, Belle, stood out for her beauty. She had shining blonde hair, clear eyes, and her beauty was not just outward but also inward. Belle was kind-hearted. She was always kind to the villagers and animals. Her warm heart made her loved by everyone. The villagers were happy to see Belle, and she always tried to repay their love. Then one day, a great typhoon came and swept away all of his wealth. The merchant's family was in great shock. All they had left was a small house in the countryside. A year had passed since they started living in the countryside. The family was gradually getting used to the new environment. Their life was simple, but they were spending happy times loving each other. Then one day a letter arrived at the merchant's house. The letter announced that a ship full of the merchant's goods was finally returning. Upon hearing this news, the merchant became excited. Filled with joy and hope, the merchant quickly started preparing for the trip. He wanted to return to the city and buy a lot of goods after a long time. Among the merchant's 3 daughters, the greedy elder sisters immediately started making demands. Father, if you go to the city, please buy us expensive clothes and necklaces." Their eyes were already filled with flashy jewels and beautiful dresses. But the youngest daughter, Belle, was different. Belle did not ask her father for anything. She had no particular desires other than her family becoming happy again. The merchant asked Belle, "Belle, do you really want nothing?" Belle answered with a warm smile, "Father, I just need a single rose." Her words came from the heart. The merchant left on his journey with his children's farewell. Arriving at the port, the merchant started his trade with great expectations. However, fate put him through another trial. Losing everything and left penniless, the merchant fell into deep despair. On his way home, the merchant lost his way in the forest. As darkness fell, the forest became a more terrifying place. Then he saw a twinkling light far away. Following the light of hope, the merchant advanced and a gigantic castle appeared before him as if from another world, mysterious and fantastic. The merchant cautiously entered the castle. It was quiet and no one was to be seen, but the inside of the castle felt warm and welcoming. In the living room, a fireplace was burning brightly. The flames warmed the merchant and melted his heart a bit. On the table was a delicious-looking chicken dish. Feeling hungry, the merchant did not hesitate to taste the dish. The delicious food offered him happiness after a long time, and he smiled spontaneously. After eating, the merchant explored the castle. Then he found a very comfortable-looking bed. Exhausted, the merchant lay down on the bed and soon fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, the merchant walked around the castle garden. The garden was beautiful, and flowers of all kinds were in bloom. Among them, the roses were particularly striking. The merchant thought of Belle. What she had wanted was just a single rose. The merchant made up his mind and picked the most beautiful rose. At that moment, a terrifying beast suddenly appeared, growling. "How dare you repay my kindness by stealing my precious flower? This is unacceptable." The voice of the beast was scary and filled with anger. Trembling with fear, the merchant pleaded, "I am truly sorry. The rose was so beautiful that I wanted to give it to my beloved daughter." The beast pondered the merchant's words for a moment and then offered a condition. "Your daughter? If she agrees to come here in your place, I will forgive you. But if she refuses, you must return yourself." When the merchant returned home, the house was bustling and filled with joy. The children rushed out, happy about their father's return. But instead of joy, the merchant's face was filled with sorrow. He shed tears without speaking. His tears brought worry to his children. In front of Belle, the merchant presented the rose. Belle, this flower is truly precious to me. Belle showed tears as she received the rose. After a while, the merchant told his family everything that had happened in the forest. The encounter with the beast and the terrifying promise. Belle decided after hearing her father's story. Father, don't worry. I will go in your place. The merchant was shocked to hear Belle's words. Belle, don't say that. I am already old, how much longer do I have to live? I will go. But Belle would not listen to her father. Father, you cannot leave me behind. I would rather be eaten by the beast than live without you. Belle, with courage, headed to the beast's castle with her father. Her heart was heavy, but at the same time it was filled with love for her family. Arriving at the castle, Belle and the merchant entered the living room. Just like the last visit, the table was set with food. The food seemed to welcome them. Belle, not wanting her father to worry, acted as if nothing was wrong. She enjoyed the food and tried to give courage to her father. After the meal, the castle was filled with the sound of heavy footsteps. Then the beast appeared. The merchant trembled with fear at the beast's appearance, but Belle maintained her composure. The beast looked at Belle and said, "You are willing to sacrifice your life to save your father. What a kind girl." Belle was a bit surprised by these words. The voice of the beast, instead of anger, carried a certain softness. The beast continued, "Leave your daughter here in the castle, and old man, return home early tomorrow morning." The merchant sighed with relief at these words, but at the same time, he was saddened by the thought of leaving his daughter behind. Belle smiled to reassure her father. The next evening, Belle was seized with fear that she might be eaten by the beast. However, she decided to spend her last moments exploring the beautiful and vast castle. "Before I die, let's explore every corner of this grand and beautiful castle." Belle made up her mind and began exploring the various rooms and halls of the castle. She marveled at the castle's lavish decorations and numerous artworks. Each room seemed to have its own story, and Belle was enchanted by it all. During her exploration, Belle found a door marked Belle's Room. "Oh, Belle's room? Shall we take a look inside?" Filled with curiosity, Belle quickly opened the door. The room was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The walls were covered with warm-colored wallpaper and fragrant flowers were placed throughout the room. The view from the window of the castle's garden was as beautiful as a painting. In the center was a large and seemingly soft bed. Next to the bed was a small desk and chair, and on one side of the wall was a large bookshelf, capturing the heart of Belle, who loved books. Belle was moved to know that this room was prepared for her. It was like a safe and comfortable refuge for her. The room was decorated more beautifully than Belle had imagined. The large bookshelf was filled with various books. Seeing them, Belle thought, "Maybe the beast doesn't intend to eat me." This thought brought a glimmer of hope to Belle's heart. As she browsed the bookshelf, she noticed a book with the golden letters, "Speak what you wish," written on the cover. Filled with curiosity and anticipation, Belle spoke, "I wish to see my father." As soon as Belle finished speaking, the large mirror in the room began to sparkle. Magically, the mirror showed Belle's home and her father, looking sad as he arrived home. Seeing this scene, Belle was surprised and at the same time sighed with relief that her father had safely arrived home. But the image in the mirror disappeared as if it was never there. That evening, as Belle was eating dinner alone at the table, the Beast appeared. Belle was initially startled but gradually felt at ease with the Beast's friendly demeanor. The Beast visited Belle every evening, spending time with her and sharing various stories. Through these meetings, Belle realized that the Beast was much more charming and kind than she had initially thought. Through conversations with the Beast, Belle discovered that the Beast was not as frightening as his appearance suggested. She began to understand the Beast's warm heart and deep inner self. However, before Belle went to bed, the Beast always asked the same question: "Belle, will you marry me?" Belle found it difficult to answer this question. "No, I'm sorry, Mr. Beast." Belle's feelings were complicated. Despite the Beast's kindness, the fact that his appearance was scary and ugly did not change. One day the Beast opened up to Belle. Belle, I love you very much. Even if you don't marry me, please promise not to leave my side." Belle was moved by the Beast's sincere words. I promise. I like you too, Beast. But I really miss my father. I saw him through the mirror and he seems to have fallen ill because of me. Besides, all my sisters are married off and even my brothers have gone to the army, leaving only the maid with him. The Beast felt a great sadness upon hearing Belle's words. I might die of sadness without you, but if you wish so much I will let you go. While Belle understood the Beast's sorrow, she couldn't stop worrying about her family. I can't let you die, Beast. I will return in a week. Hearing this, the Beast handed Belle a ring, saying, "Tomorrow you will wake up in your own home. If you wish to return, place this ring on the table before you sleep." This ring was the magical key that would allow Belle to return to the Beast's castle. The next day when Belle woke up, she realized she was in the home she had dreamed of. Her sisters, along with their husbands, came rushing in upon hearing of her return. Seeing Belle dressed like a princess, her sisters were filled with jealousy. The sisters decided to prevent Belle from returning to the Beast. Belle, stay a little longer. We've missed you so much. Belle's heart weakened by her family's plea and she decided to stay a week longer. However, on the 10th night, Belle had a terrible dream. The Beast was suffering and dying in the garden. Waking up from the dream, Belle cried, "What does it matter if he's ugly? The Beast has a kind heart. Why didn't I marry him?" At that moment, Belle realized her true feelings. She acknowledged her love for the Beast and the beauty of his inner self. Belle firmly decided to return to the Beast. She got up, took off the magic ring given by the Beast, placed it on the table and fell back asleep. When Belle woke up, she found herself back in the Beast's castle. With a fluttering heart, she waited, hoping the Beast would come to meet her in the evening. However, the Beast did not show up even late into the night. Worried, Belle ran around the castle and its surroundings, desperately looking for the Beast. Her heart became more and more anxious and filled with sorrow. Then, as in her dream, when she arrived in the garden, she found the Beast lying there. The Beast looked as if he was on the brink of death, his body weakly looking at Belle. Belle ran to the Beast's side, crying out, "My dear Beast, please don't die. Marry me." At that moment, Belle's heartfelt declaration of love echoed like magic. Her words transcended a mere promise or request, expressing deep love. It was at that moment Bright light wrapped around the beast's body and a miraculous transformation took place. Within the light, the beast turned into a handsome prince. In truth, I was a prince from a neighboring country. I was cursed to live as a beast until I met someone who loved me for who I am, not for my appearance. You were the only one who saw my heart. Thank you, Belle. Will you now marry me? Hearing the prince's confession, Belle was deeply moved. Her pure heart and love had broken the curse and revealed the true form of love to the world. Belle joyfully accepted the prince's proposal. Thanks to Belle, the spell was broken and the prince and Belle started their happy life together. Their wedding was grand and the story of their love spread far and wide. Thank you for listening to the end. Click on the playlist for more stories. Your subscription, likes, and notifications greatly support me.